In 1962, two young photographers were in a cafeteria in Memphis, chatting late into the night. This was the start of a friendship that would have a radical impact on modern colour photography. On seeing the little drugstore prints that were laid out before them by the other photographer, a young William Eggleston decided to finally start shooting in colour. Of course, Eggleston would go on to have a famous fine art career as a photographer known for his pioneering use of colour. But this is the story of the other photographer, a quiet, unassuming young man who had shown Eggleston his prints that had captured the mundane beauty of a neglected American South that was slowly disappearing under an unrelenting sea of kudzu and time. How's it? You know, every so often I am introduced to a work of a photographer whose images instantly connect with me. William Christenberry is one of them. He trained as a painter in the American South. However, it's his photography of these long forgotten, abandoned buildings in his native Hale County, Alabama, which stand out to me. Both as historical records of a place that has vanished, but also beautifully simple images of everyday mundane scenes that people at the time probably never gave a second thought to when they existed. These are the photographs that launched Christenberry's own career as a fine art photographer. Aside from being a dear friend to William Eggleston, he was also close friends with both Walker Evans and Lee Freelander, huge names in the photography world. And yet, despite being mentioned in the same breath as those photographers, whose work is extremely widely known, why is it that until very recently I'd actually never heard of William Christenberry? I wanted to know more about his photography, and what I've discovered has made me absolutely fall in love with his photos, which all started with these tiny little drugstore snapshots taken on a Kodak Brownie with 127 film.
I have very strong, mostly positive feelings about where I'm from and a deep affection for where I'm from. But I see a kind of poetry or poignancy in these things that are disappearing. The South is changing rapidly. It's becoming a more affluent part of this country, but it's unfortunate it's beginning to look like almost everywhere else.
William Christenberry spent his childhood in a place called Hale County, Alabama. And now that's quite important to know. And over the course of his life, he took photographs that are both fascinating, they're mundane in equal measures. One of the standout things is people absolutely do not feature in his images at all. The focus is purely on abandoned buildings, signs and places as they change over time and are eventually lost to history. At face value, these photographs might just be interesting snapshots of abandoned and decaying buildings, kind of a little bit like the modern trend for urbex. You know, when people go off and they just photograph places they're not supposed to be just to really document or just kind of, make images that people go, yeah, that's pretty cool. But there is more to William's fine art photography than that. It is not just a record of dilapidated buildings. And what he ultimately did with the photographs has totally amazed me. In the 1930s, Walker Evans and James Agee were in Hale County creating an article for Fortune magazine that would ultimately be known as the book Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. This was a document of the sharecroppers in the 1930s, that Depression era imagery that's best associated with the Farm Security Administration. William Christenberry was extremely fond of this book. In fact, he mentions it a number of times. And I wonder if he must have had the same feeling that I get when I look at the work by a South African photographer called David Goldblatt. in my case, Goldblatt photographed the very streets, the places I used to drive around, growing up. And I would look at those photographs and think, hey, what didn't I see there? What has Goldblatt seen that I just kind of missed? And it encouraged me to look a bit closer at my own surroundings. And I'm sure that William Christenberry must have looked at this book of these images and recognized people, places, ideas, and probably had a similar epiphany. I like to think that, when he was looking through that book, he had those ideas that kind of planted the seed in his mind that would eventually blossom into his fine art career as a photographer. But Christenberry's career in fine art photography would probably have been just a footnote to his original love of painting if it hadn't have been for a meeting with that great Walker Evans in New York.
It is probably true. I had the good fortune, Betsy Bruin mentioned this in the introduction, to know the great photographer Walker Evans, who encouraged me. He was the first person to see the little brownie snapshots. Walker Evans, that stance in many of his pictures of severe frontality and et cetera, I've never denied, I have no reason to deny Mr. Evans' great influence in so many ways. But I'll never forget that night when he and his wife came down. They had been so nice to me to invite me up to dinner. Walker wanted to see the paintings because he loved painting. He did painting himself, and I had absolutely no reservation about showing him the paintings. I was flattered. And I had those monster paintings rolled on rug tubes, that I brought all the way from Alabama. On a second visit, he said, "Young man, you mentioned you made color snapshots in reference to these paintings. I'd like to see those." I put him off. I didn't want to show him those things. I was scared. They were nothing but snapshots, as I said, processed at the local drugstore. But he was persistent. And in a little while he finished and he looked up and he said, "Young man, there's something about the way you use that little camera. It's become a perfect extension of your eye. And I suggest you take them seriously." Well, coming from Walker Evans, even then was pretty special, but I got a hard head. It didn't sink in. I wasn't interested in photography.
William Christenberry certainly does have an eye, and I feel there is a distinct difference between the two Williams. William Eggleston is reactive, moving at pace, never sitting still, one picture, on to the next one, whereas Christenberry, he's more sedate. He lets the essence of the place leach into the photographs. He comes back again and again to the same spot, documenting, photographing that passage of time. That's probably why I like his work so much. It has an authenticness about it. That authenticness makes me feel like this isn't just a dispassionate record of a building crumbling, but in the fringes of this photograph, I can feel that clammy heat of the south, the chirping cicadas in the background as William Christensen drives around from place to place, just photographing, almost like he's pointing out to us, look, that's that building where something happened years ago. I remember going to school there. All these little stories that you can imagine are echoing around these photographs that he wants to share with us. That authenticness that William Christenberry has in his images, the unique style of William Eggleston and all photographers who have stood out in the fine art world is because they have tapped into their own unique vision, their way of seeing the world. And it is one of the hardest things for a photographer to really get to grips with once you've learned all the basic stuff. And I've put together an introduction to developing your own authentic voice in photography. If you're interested in finding out more, please click on the link in the description box below. In Walker Evans's photography, people, they seem to feature most. You get a feeling that Evans is most interested in the people themselves. However, when you look at William Christensen's work, the strongest echoes that you get from being influenced by it Walker Evans is this straight-on approach to the buildings, that the buildings are the real things that he's interested in. The photographs themselves are taken like Walker Evans's, without masses of refinement. This is completely at odds with William Eggleston's sometimes crazy compositions. I wonder if that's why they were so friendly, because the two of them, both in personality and photography, are like the yin and yang, fire and ice. So you can sort of see when you get that matter-of-fact feeling of the compositions from William Christenberry, is that like he's giving the subject an equal chance to be important with all the other things he's photographing. Much like a little twist on Eggleston's idea of democratic photography, where everything is worthy of a photograph. I often used to see places like this as a photography student in South Africa. Abandoned buildings. And if you've lived anywhere where there's a bit of open space, I'm sure that you're familiar with these places. You know, like a random house or, a barn in the middle of nowhere. And you have to wonder to yourself, did the person who built this now dilapidated, half-gone place feel proud of their achievements? That store owner who originally put up that faded, rusted sign, or the person who drew a 5-cent Coca-Cola advert on the side of a building, did they ever expect that that wall would remain, that it would be photographed and treasured long after they themselves had gone? I don't really get that feeling from Eggleston or Friedlander or even Walker Evans to a degree. For me, their photographs, they serve a different purpose in my life than Christenberry's. His take me on a journey to a time and a place that are special to someone very specific. That's Mr. Christenberry, the photographer. You get that feeling from looking through his photographs that he is just wanting to share things. And that's why I love them so much, that they are presented without any real message. Now, for many photographers, the simple act of documenting a place they love and is slowly eaten by time and kudzu would be enough. But there is more to William Christenberry than just the photographs, and this is what has really made me fall in love with his approach.
I photographed this beautiful little country church in a community, or near a community, called Sprott, Alabama, S-P-R-O-T-T. And when I got the picture processed back in Washington, it began to just literally haunt me, in the best sense of that word, haunt. I just didn't know what it was saying to me. Then I had the idea of, why don't you try to make a sculpture related to this? So I went to work. I had this view with the brownie, I had a side view with the brownie, and I had a thumbnail sketch in my sketchbook of the rear of the church. And this is the end result. It took me 1 year to figure it out.
I think that is one of the most charming things that I have seen in a long time. These lovingly created, and I suppose in a way restored, buildings that can't physically be saved. Things from his heritage that he wants to preserve. That is a wonderful way of making history feel like it's now. Like you can reach out and touch it. It makes those photographs that are speaking to us transcend into something even more, because you can see the building how it probably was in its prime. And I believe he even uses the dirt that he collects from around the actual building to place the model on.
It's not easy for me to talk about. I'll try in this sense of space, isolation in space, where these buildings are, trying to evoke not nostalgia, but this deep, profound feeling for a little structure that was once there and is now gone.
Now, I am often consumed with nostalgia. At least that's what I've been told very regularly. So, of course, there is going to be an element of that in the way that I interpret these photographs, just as much as I lean on that nostalgia when I look at William Eggleston's photography. Now, you may have a different interpretation. And of course, that is the joy of the approach to this type of photography, where there isn't an obvious statement being made by the photographer. You know, they're not trying to give you a message or make some eye candy or, you know, any of this kind of stuff. They are just leaving it open to your own individual interpretation by the matter-of-factness about the way that the subject or the place has been photographed. With Walker Evans photographing Hale County and William Christenberry living in Hale County, it's not hard to see why Walker Evans's photography influenced Mr. Christenberry so very much. If you are interested in finding out more about Walker Evans and his amazing sympathetic photography, check out this video over here. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I will see you again soon.